First off, thanks everybody for joining us today's professional presentation. When the committee kind of got together, about 6 or 7 months ago, and we're trying to come up with ways that we could still make this in the ACG Cup, a really great experience for students. In kind of this virtual world, one of the things that we really wanted to make sure that we were able to pass along was a chance for students to kind of have time when in a small group, the small group discussions to further learn about, industries, to further learn about potential jobs, and then to get, in front of, key people kind of in the Portland market. And so one of the ways that we decided to do that was to introduce kind of, these industry presentations or small group discussions. And we're fortunate to have, several of our sponsors kind of step up in a big way and volunteer their time to kind of share and present, to you guys. So today we have, Chartwell Financial, Olivia, who is on the board, is part of the executive committee, who played a very large role in not only writing the case that you guys were analyzing, but also in kind of co-coordinating with the universities and the judges and you all. Her and her firm will be presenting today. They've created a really good presentation, kind of outlining, a couple things that I think you guys will find really useful and also entertaining. If you guys do have questions kind of throughout, go ahead and kind of ask away. I hope that's okay, Olivia, that
that's
allowing me to do that. And yeah, this is truly meant for you guys, to offer another kind of supplemental education experience. We are filming today's presentation, so I know, Shauna, you mentioned a couple of your teammates are going to kind of pop in and pop out. So this will be available, to view afterwards. And with that, I'll kind of turn over to the Chartwell team led by Olivia and Ryan.
Thanks, Brad. So, thank you so much for being with us today. We are going to be covering a little bit more about our firm. So we have a bit of a unique firm in that we do provide investment banking services, but we also have a broad array of other services. So Ryan and I are going to talk a little bit today about kind of the history of our company, the service offerings we do provide our clients, and then we're going to dive a little deeper into the investment banking side of things, of what a typical sell-side analysis looks like from our perspective and the steps we go through. And then we are also going to touch on a case study of a deal that we closed last year and provide a little more detail about that and what the overall process entailed. So I'm going to, there we go. All right, I'm going to start with myself. So my name's Olivia. As Brad mentioned, I'm also on the ACG Cup committee, and I got involved with the ACG Cup committee 5 years ago when we founded the ACG Cup Northwest, because I had participated in the ACG Cup back in Minnesota when I was a grad student getting my MBA. So it's really cool to be on this side of the table and help provide such a great experience, because it was definitely instrumental to my career. And so that's a little bit about how I got involved in the Cup. But my background at overall, so I joined Chartwell in 2013. It was right after I had graduated from my MBA program. I was born and raised in Minnesota. I started working at Chartwell in our Minneapolis, Minnesota office. And I moved out to our Portland office in early 2014. So I hadn't been at Chartwell too long. I primarily today work in our valuation and transaction opinion practice, and Ryan will get into more about what that entails. I work with a lot of ESOP companies, so that's employee stock ownership plans, where the company is owned by a trust that is essentially the beneficiaries are the employees of the company. So we're also going to get into a little bit of that. And then I do have some experience on the investment banking side of things, working on both the buy side and sell side advisory. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan, who is my colleague in the Portland office.
Thanks, Olivia. I have 8-month-old, so I'm a little under the weather, and I'll try to mute myself if I cough. So I don't cough in your ear. But that backstory aside, my name is Ryan Atchley. I am a senior associate at Chartwell. I have been with Chartwell for just over 5 years now. Before that, I worked for one of Oregon's largest investment firms. It's one of the largest independent private, typically focused on high net worth. And my role there was in the investment allocation, and I covered hedge funds, private equity, and direct deals and making investments. I started in Chartwell early 2016, started as kind of an experienced analyst, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but moved up to more where I am now, a senior associate, and help manage ESOP valuations and do with a couple of sprinklings of transactions as well. Like Brad said, and like Olivia said, really kind of envision this as hoping that this is, we cover what Chartwell does to start a dialogue and start a discussion around the potential career paths that are out there, or, really just give you some exposure to what we do on a day-to-day basis that, you'll find, and you probably already found that there's a lot of elements of it that are similar to the case study that you probably all are very busy working on right now, I would imagine. Can you go to the next slide, Olivia? I'll just kind of set the roadmap of kind of what we're thinking for today. And, like Brad mentioned, feel free to ask questions at any point, but really, my thoughts for today were to take you through what Chartwell is, the type of work we do, the type of work I do on a day-to-day basis. And, as we're going through it, if you have any questions, please ask them, because I just don't want to, you get enough lecturing. So don't want to lecture you for the next hour. So, but really the goal, we're going to cover the four various service line that Chartwell has: valuation, where I spend most of my time, probably a little similar to Olivia; transaction opinions; corporate finance; advisory work; and then dive a little deeper into our corporate finance practice, look at a sell-side M&A case and the process, and then wrap it up with any sort of questions and answers that you may have as we're going through it. So the Chartwell overview, probably best to start here. As I mentioned before, kind of delineated into four various service lines: advisory, corporate finance, transaction opinions, and valuation. When we look across our geographic exposure, we're across the United States. The mothership is really Minneapolis. We have, I think it's around 82 people now. There's 8 of us out in Portland. There's 3 down in Orange County, probably 60 plus in Minneapolis, and 10 plus in Chicago. Really kind of, as we think about it, valuation spans the whole company. Really the company's founding and history is based in ESOP valuations, which, as Olivia mentioned before, is employee stock ownership plans. But from really the founding of the company, it's, I guess I should say, ESOPs and the needs that companies have based on ESOPs has really kind of set the foundation of what we do. And then we've kind of added service lines or bolted on service lines to really kind of meet client demands. And I think that's certainly the case for the corporate finance division that you see over to the right. Certainly the case for the advisory division, which focuses on the nuances that ESOPs have as they grow older and older. That is, so things like ESOP repurchase obligation, which is as a plan gets older and older, there are participants who leave the plan, and so focusing on managing the cash flows for that type of thing. Just working through the various service lines, the bulk of our time is spent in the valuation department on the very bottom there. And we'll talk about that. If you, Olivia, flip to the next slide, please. Well, it's actually the next, I won't bore you with our model, but really our basic goal in what we do is providing a comprehensive suite of services. really just to meet the needs and demands of a business. And that's kind of how we think about it. That's our mission statement. And really our service lines have evolved just to meet business needs and demands. So yeah, page 9, this is where I spend most of my time. I think valuation is, to me, it's pretty interesting. I think it's an interesting mix of science and art, because, you have the science component of it, which is the numbers don't lie. But then you have the art component of it, which is the judgment. It's, understanding multiples, it's understanding markets, it's being able to translate information to ultimately what is the value of something. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking all these inputs and ultimately coming up with one output. And that's usually, we're valuing the company in its entirety. We call it enterprise value. I'm sure you folks know that. And the reason we're doing that for the most part is for various different outcomes. So each line of service expertise, if you will, in these gold boxes, the work we're doing is materially the same. It's building a model, understanding the comps that are out there, most often running a DCF, which I'm sure you guys are doing, and ultimately using that input and those various different indications to come to a value. And then from there, we're imputing that to get to a share price, if you will. So I spend most of my time in the ESOP ERISA category there. And I think it's kind of a somewhat unique valuation and business model in that, and I guess for those of you who don't know, ERISA is the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, which basically says that if you have an ESOP or you have an employee-owned company, that those companies need to be valued once per year, primarily just for administration purposes. And it's kind of a unique business model in that we have that sticky revenue, and we're there and in front of clients for whatever needs they may have. So if they're saying, hey, we want to acquire a different company, or hey, we need this various different service line, we can be there to help provide the service with the kind of backbone that we have in the other divisions.
Hey, Ryan.
As it relates,
Ryan, sorry, this is Brad. Kind of just a couple questions that kind of popped to my head. What kind of industries, does your kind of firm kind of cover? Do you guys specialize in one or two? And then kind of the second question that I had is, speaking on ESOPs, before companies traditionally go the ESOP route, are these family-owned businesses, or what's kind of usually the transition into an ESOP?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was getting to that, but yeah, we can answer it now. We don't specialize in any industry segment. For example, I manage between 20 and 30 valuations per year. My client scope could be, it's as diverse as a Hawaii tourism company that provides, cruise lines, travel accommodations, vehicle accommodations. So, Hawaii tourism on one spectrum, and then I have a lamb slaughterhouse, which is an ESOP, surprisingly enough. So it's the most random variety. And I think, quite frankly, starting this job, and I think Olivia can attest to this, is some of the fascination behind the job is you don't realize how many different types of businesses there are out there. And getting exposure in this context through evaluation, you really get the full keys to the kingdom. You get to see how decisions that are made in one year affect the company in the next year. And you get to see how, the C-suite, and you have direct access to the C-suite and see how they operate. As it relates to ESOPs and how those get put in place, typically there's a couple different ways, but what we see the most is that, let's say, for example, there is a selling shareholder or one person or a group of people who own a business. They are, coming to a succession plan and determine that really they want to give the business back to the employees. And so from there, it may seem a little counterintuitive, but in order to do that, what will typically happen is they'll hire a trustee who is a third-party representative, and it's their job to determine and make sure that the employees are being represented. The trustee, the third party who is representing the employees, will hire us, and we are solely to do the valuation work. And ultimately what we conclude on is that we conclude on the value of the company, but it's in the context of a transaction. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of transaction opinions, but that's typically how we see the structure get put into place, and how we see a lot of the transition from a family-owned business to an employee-owned stock plan.
And I just want to add that it's not just, I think a lot of people think ESOPs are just for these tiny mom and pop companies that can't go out and get financing or can't find a buyer. I mean, I know Ryan has very large companies, and I have, some of my clients are 2 billion in sales and, very sophisticated management teams. They could be publicly traded, but they're an ESOP. So it's for a variety of reasons that people choose the ESOP route. A lot of time it's to preserve the culture and the employees and the legacy of the founders, and to ensure stability. If you do get acquired by a private equity group, there's no guarantee that half your workforce isn't going to be let go as they provide synergies. So, I think it's interesting because it wasn't one of the options in the case, but as I was reading the case, I was like, oh, this could be an interesting route to go. Maybe we can build in an ESOP scenario next year, Brad.
Yeah, let's do that. Olivia, you just kind of mentioned, you have some ESOPs, very large. What's kind of, the sweet spot company size that you guys work with, or what's kind of the company size or is there a company size where the ESOP, kind of strategy kind of starts to make sense, or owners to really kind of start considering going that route?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have a broad range of size of companies. On the bottom end, I think the smallest we would go in terms of top line revenue is about 5 million. And it depends on their bottom line margin, but really they need to have the cash flow to sustain the ESOP. So being able to make payments to the ESOP every year to either fund the buyout of the management or founder, and then two, to fund what Ryan mentioned earlier, the repurchase obligation. So when people leave the company, their shares legally have to be bought out by the company, and the company needs to make sure they have enough funds to do that. So when you get a really tight cash flow stream, really low cash flow stream, it's just not a good fit. But there's really no cap as to how big a company can earn ESOP.
I would add to just employee count usually can dictate an ESOP. If you have, an employee or a group that's, 5 million in sales, but there's only 4 employees, it probably doesn't really make sense to go the ESOP route, because one person leaving is 20% of your staff and they could hold a huge portion of the company. But yeah, I think, my average client base is, I'd say solidly middle market, but creeping upward. So that could be, 50 million in revenue and 10% margin. So 50 on the top and 5 million on the bottom. But I have clients as large as 700 million in revenue and 50 million in profitability. So there is no sweet spot, but I think, there is a pretty solid floor where ESOPs just don't economically and people-wise kind of pan out.
Yeah, great.
But I mean, from my perspective, it is pretty interesting. We can look at a couple of representative companies. There's certainly some large ones here in the Northwest that we actually work on. But it's interesting to think, and there's been a lot of studies that have shown that employee-owned companies, because each person owns a small sliver of the company, and if they can fully understand that, they are, more financially productive than a typical one person or a family ownership structure. So, it's not just a feel good, there are kind of a true ROI, if you will, on ESOP owned companies. So this kind of sets the stage for all the various types of valuations that we do. I'm going to just talk through 4 slides of the nitty gritty for each division. If you go to the next page here, Olivia. So ESOP and ERISA, we kind of already talked about this. You'll probably see a couple pictures and some names that you may recognize. I think most people have had some products for that company in the top right. They're a kind of a large hallmark ESOP in the Northwest. But really, this kind of just covers our expertise, how we value companies, how we think about companies, and the various types of companies that are out there. So like Olivia said, there are some very large employee-owned companies. And I think, the general motivation for founders is that in anecdotally, this is what I've heard, that, I didn't build this company by myself. It was with the help of the employees. So this ownership structure lets me reward the people who help build my business. Page 11 just talks about the general types of valuations from a corporate planning perspective. Again, a lot of the work is the same. It's just kind of the scope of why we're doing the valuation. So as you can see on the right there, it could be for buy-sell agreements that are in place. It could be for buyouts. It could be for combining certain divisions that are separately owned. On the bottom there, we highlight it. We don't do a ton of litigation support services, meaning we would be in a expert type witness context for litigation. We tend to stay away from that just from an economic standpoint. The numbers kind of don't really pencil out for the time investment. Certainly there's a large market for it, but we kind of typically tend to stay away from the highly scrutinized, litigious type valuations. A couple other scopes on the next page in terms of the valuations that we provide. This is for any accounting folks here. Our equity compensation is really focused on 409A and ASC 718. And for the non-accounting folks, really the valuations here are fair market value context. And that being said, if you're going to offer, and it's an accounting mechanism for typically granting some type of equity ownership or equity compensation. And if you're granting the equity ownership or equity compensation, very simply, you can't grant it if you don't know what it's worth. So that's where we come in and help companies, typically on the earlier stage or kind of less mature companies who are granting equity type compensation. You can see a lot of names there for, excuse me, for healthcare and kind of therapeutics companies. We've seen a nice kind of resurgence of a lot of biotech companies who can't necessarily pay a employee with true cash compensation. So as many of you know, they're granting various types of equity ownership or equity compensation for that type of exchange. So yeah, tax compliance and financial reporting, but really kind of focused on early stage, pre-revenue, complex capital structure companies. And it certainly makes the job more interesting in, you get, like I mentioned before, you get a wide variety of exposure to not only different industries, but different life cycles of businesses. So, it's very much different valuing a pre-revenue biotech company than it is a mature distributor of widgets. There's a lot of nuances to that type of valuation. And I think from my perspective, it keeps it interesting in terms of the specialties that you need to acquire and quite frankly, the learning that you need to do in order to feel confident in the valuation. This page just talks about our gift and estate practice. Gift and estate, relatively simple. It's similar to the other types of valuations that we do, but these types of valuations are dictated by the scopes. So we see valuations for estate planning purposes. We do valuations for wealth management advisors, for accountants, really helping kind of ownership transition from select parties to other different types of parties. And because of that transition, you need to know what the value is. And it helps for, tax purposes and really estate planning purposes. Next page is really somewhat of a smaller sec, but similar to the other types of valuations that we offer, it's more focused on the accounting standards, ASC 805, 820, and 350, as you can see in the middle of the page there. So we do purchase price accounting, we do fair value measurements and goodwill impairments. For those of you with the accounting background, pretty necessary for various types of transactions, for goodwill measurements, and just for general financial reporting purposes. Understanding what a company's worth is certainly within our wheelhouse. On the bottom, I think where I'm more interested in is we do a lot of unique one-off valuations, specialty valuations for exotic capital structures or derivatives. We do valuations for synthetic equity, stock appreciation rights, phantom shares, all sorts of different equity ownership and equity type compensation mechanisms. One interesting kind of tidbit, and I guess it shows you that the evolution of how we work with clients and how we kind of grow our services to meet their needs. Back in 2015, we started working with a cannabis adjacent company. So they have supplied a lot of the lights, equipment, fertilizers, nutrients, etc. And in 2015, they decided they wanted to become an ESOP. So we helped put in place and structure the transaction to go from a single family ownership to ownership within 500 different employees. So they all owned a commiserate share of the company. And then just recently, they were acquired. So the ESOP was bought by a third-party private equity group. And a year and a half ago, private equity ownership group kind of formed the company to be more of an institutional type company. And then more recently, they went and took that company public. And a month into being public, they came back to us and said, hey, we need some valuation work. We know that we know you guys did a good job in the past for our ESOP. And they came back to us and wanted valuation of some of their synthetic equity. So they wanted some restricted units valued. They wanted some derivatives valued, and they wanted some convertible debt valued. So I think it was kind of interesting to grow with the company and see the life cycle of, this company from, a reasonably smaller middle market company to a much larger company, as that's where the legal market, as the legal market opened up, I should say, they're able to capitalize it and grow and ultimately get acquired by a private equity company and ultimately go public. So pretty, unique example, and one I like to kind of hold out as our hallmark for, it's not just boring financial reporting purposes that we do valuations.
Yeah, just kind of one more question kind of on that, just kind of comparing, business models to, how your team operates to, my team operates. One of the unique things with any kind of service providers is your go-to-market strategy and, really trying to find who has or who is the decision maker within these organizations, to bring in. A lot of times, companies will be, owner-led, where the CEO is still the primary owner of the company, and they're the key decision maker. They're the one that, our MDs are pitching to, that ultimately will bring our team in to kind of do our scope of work. But with an ESOP that, might not, that doesn't have one primary owner, where ownership is kind of, distributed throughout, who holds that key relationship that you guys are closely working with, that hires your team or decides to bring your team in to perform some of these services?
Do you mean like within the C-suite?
Yeah, I mean, does the C-suite still kind of have the same, pull or same kind of authority to bring in service providers? Are you guys working with the trustee?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's usually dependent on the scope of the type of agreement we're working on. So for like an ESOP valuation, obviously that's done at the behest of a trustee. So we are brought in typically by the trustee, but I would say, just as strong a relationship as we have with the trustee, we need to have with the company, because the company can effectively say, we don't want to work with this person, or on the flip side, they can say, we want to work with this firm because we've heard good things. And usually a trustee will acknowledge that and put us in consideration for the type of work. Financial reporting and gift estate work and the other types of non-ESOP, we call it valuation less ESOP work. Those relationships are really held with, it's really held within the C-suite. It's held with CFOs, presidents, CEOs. And I think, we do get some crossover from having a very strong name in the ESOP community and the valuation community, that people kind of know about what we do and kind of know the services that we provide. I don't know, Olivia, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I would say, certainly the relationship with the company, the C-suite, is still strong, regardless if we're ESOP or not, like Ryan said. Kind of a weird situation because we're retained by an ESOP trustee, but the company pays us directly because we're doing the work for them. So we have to have a good relationship with both parties. And then I would say on like financial reporting and some of these other branches of valuation that we do, certainly the primarily the relationship is held with the C-suite, but also we get referred in a lot through CPAs, wealth managers, and lawyers. So those are other relationships that we are cultivating and developing in our careers.
Sure. Yeah, that makes total sense. Thanks, guys.
There's one question on, I think it was, what's the initial time frame for valuation? I think if I understand the question correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, the time frame for evaluation can be wildly different based on the scope of service. So, the second part of that statement was correct. But our typical process is, you can see it here, this whole process from step 1 to step 5 is about a 4-week process. Starting at step 1, we send I would call it overwhelming list of due diligence items that we need. And due diligence items would be any sort of financial, operational, employee related, corporate related, legal matters. It's basically an all-encompassing list that we send to a company to make sure that we have all the information that we need to really conclude on the value of the company. From there, that's usually a 1-week process. Then we're doing something, step 2, very similar to the case study. We're going to the market, looking at comps, looking at the industry, understanding drivers, understanding trends, understanding basic important considerations. And there are, if you work on there's a client that I work on that's a investment advisory firm. So understanding things like what are their assets under management, or like going back to the previous example of the slaughterhouse, understanding what's their throughput, understanding, how have sheep trends, which I never thought I would ever read about, how have sheep trends been over the last couple of years based on weather conditions or based on changes in genetics. So, there's a lot of work that goes into it. And I think it's definitely a type of job that it's someone who's always looking to learn something. It's a kind of a continual learning job. And that's kind of what I appreciate about it. I think maybe it might turn off some people just because it's pretty time and effort intensive, but the end result I think is worth it. From there, we formulate our value analysis. We usually come together as a team. I didn't mention this before, but we typically work in teams of 3 to 4. The bulk of the work kind of gets done, hand entering data, keying in data into our model. We build a full 3-statement model, including a forecast, if a client doesn't provide it for us. That 3-statement model usually turns into like a 15-statement model in our very complex internal model. But, we get together as a team, ultimately conclude on a value. That's step 4 in our value determination. And then from there, we draft a pretty lengthy narrative report on the value of the company. And I think, the hard part and the thing we joke about is on the second page of our valuation report, there's a share price, and most people read the first page and the second page, and then they throw the rest away because it's 120 pages. But that's mainly a joke. Most of our clients kind of read through our analysis, and we do our own in-house industry analysis. We have two guys on our team who do industry analysis and economic research for each valuation that we work on. And I think a lot of the clients appreciate that value that we do bring to the table. So, from there, it's a 130-page report. We usually give that to whoever hires us. So in certain cases, it could be the trustee, it could be the CFO, it could be the C-suite. And then we kind of make ourselves available to review that valuation report and answer or respond to any challenges that may come about. And we certainly see, especially as it relates to financial reporting, especially in the financial reporting like pre-IPO or large public companies, we certainly do get a lot of challenges. So, throughout the process, it's a different type of challenge. It's getting through large amounts of data. It's synthesizing large amounts of data into a model. It's kind of putting your thinking cap on and understanding the drivers of an industry and understanding how that would translate to the value of a company, understanding how to value a company in appropriate multiples, and then, drafting, which is more of a creative element of telling the story, how and why we think the company's valued at this price. And then, lastly, responding to any challenges and being able to think creatively to kind of solve any questions that are posed. Lastly, we kind of already covered it, but we do transaction opinions. Really, the bulk of the business here is in the fairness opinion side. So you can see on the bullet point list just the rough scope of services for the types of fairness opinions that we offer. And really, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure many of you do, but a fairness opinion is essentially we do all the valuation work to conclude either yes or no. So we'll do all the valuation work to write a fairness opinion, which essentially says that based on the scope of services, that this transaction is fair from a fair market value standpoint. And that could be for like mergers and acquisitions. It could be for combinations of businesses. It could be someone has or a company has a large debt load and they're looking to recapitalize, and they need the sign off of the ESOP trustee to say that, okay, the terms of this new debt load, be it the interest rate, the maturity, the terms of how it gets paid down, that they're all fair from a financial fair market value standpoint. So really, we kind of respond to the whatever demand a client or a business needs in terms of providing the types of transaction opinions.
And do you typically provide these fairness opinions for, are these, businesses that are getting acquired, or these businesses, who are the acquirer?
Yeah, so it could be either way. In the ESOP context, we're most likely providing a fairness opinion to the trustee. For the example I used earlier of the hydroponic distribution company, they had gotten an offer from a third party. So it's our job to say, it's basically going through evaluation again to say that this third party offer from a valuation standpoint is fair, and that the terms within this transaction and the structuring of this transaction are fair from a fair market value standpoint. Outside of the ESOP context standpoint, we've done fairness opinions for board of directors. That's usually another kind of likely suspect of who needs these types of valuations and these opinions. So it could be for buying a company, it could be for selling a company, kind of a wide variety of different uses. I want to just, before going into Olivia, any questions from anyone else in the group? Did I answer the question earlier? Okay.
All right. So now I'll take over and we'll dive into our corporate finance practice. And we call it corporate finance internally. I've actually been asked this by other people I've met. They're like, why don't you just call it your investment banking group? But we like to call it our corporate finance group because we do more than just investment banking per se. So this page here highlights a little bit of the services we provide, but a little background on our corporate finance practice. So we didn't officially form this practice until 2010 when we brought on two experienced investment bankers from ABM AMRO in Chicago. And as Ryan mentioned throughout his presentation, that valuation is really core to our business, and it's valuation's core to investment banking as well. So it was very complementary to the expertise and the advice that we were already providing our clients. And over the years, as our clients grew, our ESOP clients, valuation clients, as they grew, they would, start acquiring companies. They'd start selling off divisions. They always came to us as their trusted advisor. So it just made sense to kind of formally launch an investment banking practice. So in the past decade, our investment banking group has grown from about 2 people who came on in 2010. And I think today we have about 20 people, and it continues to be a very quickly growing part of our overall practice. And then those are people just solely dedicated to investment banking. There's people like me who I'll work on a few projects throughout the year, but I'm not technically part of our formal investment banking group. But our range of services that you see here on the page are fairly standard. So we advise on both sell side and buy side acquisitions. We have a capital markets group that's dedicated to debt and equity placements. We have a special situations group that was just brought on a couple years ago that focuses on restructuring and advising during bankruptcy proceedings and distressed M&A advisory. And then lastly, we have kind of what our niche is, and that's advising on the sale to ESOPs, which can be very complex transactions in large corporations. So typically in these transactions, the debt stack is very high with really large portions of mezzanine debt or other types of subordinated debt. And on the right-hand side, you can see some of our representative clients. Our investment banking practice is centered in Chicago, but we work all across the country. A couple of big ones, Taylor Guitars, you might have heard of, or Cliff Bar, I'm sure you've heard of. So we've done a lot of work on the West Coast as well. So I want to go a little deeper into sell side advisory because that's what your role is in this case. So in a little bit, I'll go into the actual methods and timelines of a typical sell side deal process. But this page lists some of the reasons why Chartwell is unique from other investment banking firms. And so first, I think really we're focused on the client's objectives, and we are completely unbiased in the outcome for the seller. So we're not associated with any banks or wealth management firms, and we have no conflicts of interest. Secondly, we are able to customize the transaction process given our significant experience and deep ties to the ESOP community, along with the architecture and engineering community. So this is something that I think, Brad, you asked earlier if we do have any, industries that we focus on. We technically don't, but everyone works across a very broad array of industries. But our architecture and engineering practice is the one vertical that we actually have some dedicated staff to, and part of it's just the way engineering firms are generally structured. They are owned by employees, whether or not it's an ESOP or not. But the ESOP lends kind of a nice complementary structure to that ownership of engineering firms. So we've gained a lot of traction in the past several years in the ESOP architecture space. So that's actually been a huge catalyst for our company and investment banking group. We've done a lot of deals in the last 5 years or so that are in that industry. And then third, we've been on both sides of the table, so we understand complex dynamics and strategies that are in play during negotiations, and we have a lot of very experienced team members to guide us with that. And then moving on to our last, practice in Chartwell is advisory. And this was officially launched about 5 years ago with some experienced hires, but it's really something we've been providing to our clients for a while. It covers all the basic services outside of valuation, opinions, and investment banking. So it's really focused on ownership succession, capital planning, and executive retention. So in ownership advisory, we help business owners define their objectives and goals. So whether that's liquidity, they want to sell their company, they want to put in an ESOP, they're interested in a management buyout. And then we provide education and we model out various scenarios. And then finally, we help them coordinate the teams to execute. So helping with legal, tax, CPA, and getting those teams all together. We also have a small compensation consulting group, which is really focused on designing long-term incentive plans. So, this ties into providing salary ranges for executives, bonus programs, and then typically some sort of synthetic equity. And then lastly, we have a highly specialized team that focuses on ESOPs and their overall repurchase obligation, which Ryan mentioned earlier. So I'm not going to go into too much of that detail now. So our advisory practice just has a lot that goes into making sure that the company has the cash flows to fund their different initiatives and objectives. So this is kind of a nice slide of how we approach our overall engagements in the advisory practice. So starting at the top right, outlining the strategic objectives, making sure we fully understand what management wants to do, what issues they're having, what do they want to accomplish. Then we review their current ownership, whether it's an ESOP group or it's an individual or it's a large group of shareholders. Then we can tie in any executive compensation. And then where it's interesting is we get creative, and based on what we know, we get to help develop different scenarios and solutions. And we typically limit the scope of our engagement to 2 or 3, and we'll run different analysis through our model, run sensitivity analysis on these, look at what the impact is to future value of the company and future shareholder value, and then make sure that fits in with their current capital structure, and that capital structure can support the overall solutions that we've provided. So really we take a holistic look and look at it from every angle. And this has been a really growing part of our business over the past couple of years, and it's been pretty fun to work on. So I work on a little bit of these projects, a little bit of valuation and investment banking. But like I said, we want to focus a little more on investment banking, and I know we've really hit it hard on valuations and ESOPs. So we're going to spend the rest of the time really just on investment banking. So I wanted to start with our typical sell side M&A process. And, I apologize if this is, very nuanced or basic for some people, but I think it's interesting just to see, these are the slides that we actually show our clients when we're going to pitches of how the process will work from their perspective. So really we have 4 different phases, starting with the planning phase, then getting into marketing, reaching out to buyers, and then kind of doing due diligence, narrowing it down in the investigation phase, and then finally going through negotiations. So this process can take, anywhere from 10 weeks to 30 weeks. Again, this is the slide we show our clients. So we like to keep it shorter, but in all reality, it's typically much greater than 30 weeks in some cases, just depending on, the kind of market clearing process we go through. I'm talking about a case study in a little bit here, and that was, significantly longer than 30 weeks because we reached out to like 200 buyers almost. But if, a client comes to you and they have maybe 2 or 3 offers in hand already, it could be a much shorter process. So really getting into these different phases. So the first phase, the planning phase, this is really where kind of our valuation core comes into effect. So this is when we're going out to the company, we're meeting with their management team, we're touring their facilities, and really what we want to do is understand their business, in addition to understand why they want to sell. So there can be a lot of different factors at play. If they want to sell just for liquidity, if they want to continue to run the business, if they're having issues, if they just want to grow and expand. So thinking about through all these variables, and then, as I mentioned, doing our full valuation process where we collect all the data, determine a value range, kind of setting a baseline for the client expectations, and then developing a strategy. So, sitting down and thinking about how we want the transaction to go, things that the client might be willing to do, not willing to do, like roll equity into the new company, or have an earnout as a portion of the proceeds, or do they need all the cash up front? And that's it's kind of black or white in that instance. So we like to just see what sort of things the client might have in mind before going out and contacting buyers. Then we hit the marketing phase, the second phase. So we are basically searching and looking for buyer lists. So this can be very different depending on the scope of the project, depending on the industry they're in. Like I said before, we have a lot of architecture engineering clients. So there's a huge market for that, both with strategic buyers and with financial buyers like private equity groups. If that's the case, we're going to our contacts in the AE, architecture engineering space, making contact with them, getting a sense for if they'd be interested. But then what we're also doing is picking up the phone and cold calling private equity groups. We're running screens through PitchBook and Capital IQ to look at private equity groups that have made an investment or sold an engineering group in the past 5 years. So it can be pretty tedious, also kind of interesting. And then at the same time, we're starting to put together documents that we're going to plan on sending out to the buyers. So first we have a teaser, which is a 1-page document that pretty much gives a quick summary of the company, why they're selling, what makes them different, what's going to drive their growth in the future, and then a snapshot of their financials. And then we're also going to start developing a SIM, which is a confidential information memorandum. And that's a full kind of binder of the company, put together really pretty, of what they do, who they are. Again, kind of expands on what makes them different, what are the drivers in their forecast, what's their historical financial performance been like. So as we're doing that and developing that, we're also reaching out to buyers and starting to receive indications of interest. And these are just non-binding letters basically saying, yes, we've seen, a brief snapshot of the company. We'd like to receive more information. So then we send them basically a confidentiality non-disclosure agreement and give them access to the data room. So in the data room, also, it's a big part of an analyst role or even associate's role in investment banking is to manage all the data that buyers are seeing, making sure that they're getting all the data they need. And then once they have that, they'll start to, provide, I guess, further interest or not. And our client can determine if they want to invite the buyer in and have a management presentation. So this is a face-to-face meeting with the potential buyer and the seller, where they get to meet each other, make sure there's, good synergies between them. The buyer will get to go tour the facilities, meet other members of key management if that's the case. And really just it's usually go to dinner afterwards. It's just a chance to really get to know one another. At that point, if the buyer is still interested, they'll provide a letter of intent. And usually you'll receive, multiple LOIs from different buyers. And then that's, as an investment banker, you sit down with your client and really make sure you understand all of them and, calculate the proceeds from each proposed transaction, and help your buyer help your seller make the right decision. And then once the seller has decided on who the buyer is, then we enter negotiations, and it can be a pretty lengthy process, or it can be pretty clean, depending on how much was negotiated during the LOI phase. So, this is when you get other people involved. You get legal teams on both sides involved. You get CPAs, tax consultants. So there's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of meetings, a lot of calls, and ultimately, hopefully you can land a deal, sign closing documents, and then announce it. So we help a client every step of the way. We are there, from day one, helping them think things through, helping them put together documents to go to market, using our contacts. So it's a very all-intensive role, but it's pretty interesting and really satisfying to see it through. Like I said, it can take much longer than 30 weeks. Sometimes it can take shorter. Another aspect I didn't cover was lender discussions. So, depending if you're on the buy side or sell side, if you're on the buy side, you might need to, have lender discussions to make sure you have the appropriate financing before you go out and purchase a company. But we were focusing mostly on sell side, so I didn't touch on that.
Olivia, it may just be my computer, but I think I'm stuck on slide 27. Is that the same for everybody else?
Oh,
Yeah, it's the same for me too.
sorry about
There
that.
we go.
Well, you don't care, but it's showing up on both screens on mine, so I was clicking on the wrong one, so I apologize. Well, I already went through all of these, so we're going to keep going. I know we're running short on time, and I want to get to the case study, so I'm not even going to talk about this dual track process, but basically what it is we can run through that whole sell side analysis with a company, but on the same side, be doing it in tandem with an ESOP. So kind of going in the background, ESOP doesn't have a doesn't have a buyer per se, it's the trustee. So we're working with the trustee and kind of setting up baseline valuation. And then at the end, when the management does have an offer in hand from a buyer, they can compare that to what they would get doing an ESOP and then make a decision. We're just going to go right to the case study. So this is a deal that I worked on last year, and it's a pretty cool story. So the company is an engineering firm based in Las Vegas. They were founded in 2001, so not too old, about 20 years. They do environmental consulting, construction materials testing, soil inspection. So it doesn't sound super interesting, but some of the projects that they're working on and people they're dealing with is really cool. So before I get into that, another really interesting aspect of this client was that their CEO, James Bristow, was given a majority stake at the company in 2012. He was 27 years old, and his mentor and former CEO and founder just really believed in him. He at that time, he was still getting his MBA and engineering degree. I think he's working on his PhD. So he's a super sharp guy. And what's interesting is that he's super charismatic. So in the engineering space, I work with a ton of engineering clients. They can be pretty dry and dull. And James is very different. So he has kind of an entrepreneurial mind. Since he took over the company in 2012, they've made a number of acquisitions. They opened 2 other offices one in Southern California, one in Reno. And he has slowly developed just a really good, solid team of very experienced engineers. So it was interesting going to market with him at the helm because we had a lot of interest due to the fact that he, one, is super engaging, had a really enthusiastic outlook for the company and a strong track record of already growing the company through acquisitions. And really he wanted liquidity, but he wants to stay involved in the company. So that made it an attractive candidate for a lot of private equity groups. And really he just needed a capital infusion kind of to help continue growing the company, continuing to acquire firms and open new offices. So that was pretty cool. So by the time we were doing this transaction, he was only 35 years old. And it was just kind of fun to see. But some cool projects that they worked on and that we talked a lot about. One was the Las Vegas Convention Center People Mover. So this was a project that started in 2019, and it was led by Elon Musk, the Boring Company. So they're basically using boring machines to make an underground tunnel system below the convention center that will be basically run by autonomous vehicles, like you can see in the picture here. And it's about a 1 or 2 mile loop overall. And so Nova was hired by Elon Musk's company to do some testing of the soils, testing the structural steel and the concrete, and doing other things like that. But a really cool project. They also were working on this huge development in Las Vegas, downtown Summerlin, which was millions of square feet of mixed-use development space, and they do a lot of hotels and resorts on the Strip as well. And then some clients over here, real quick, they have an in with the Raiders stadium. So with the new stadium, they were doing a lot of work for years on that. They have agreement with McDonald's. So they do all the McDonald's in a certain region outside Vegas. And they work with some high-end home companies. So they did all the construction testing and inspections and some geotechnical engineering for Celine Dion's home that was built over like a 4 or 5 year period. It was some like insane compound. So they do some kind of cool projects for a geotechnical engineering company. So like I said earlier, so starting at the top left, the transaction overview. So they really wanted a recapitalization of the company. They wanted some liquidity, but all the management wanted to stay on and continue running the company, which was, like I said, attractive to a lot of private equity groups. And they were willing to roll equity, so it would be less cash up front. So Chartwell was hired to sell them. So we went through the entire process with them. We did a very broad market clearing process, 160 potential buyers. About half of them were private equity groups, about half were strategic buyers. We relied on a lot of our contacts in the engineering space, and they received multiple indications of interest. They're not a huge company, so that was one of the biggest negative feedbacks we got, was just like, okay, call us in 2 years when they double their size, which is what was in our projections. But they still had a pretty solid track record. And what happened is we were down to 3 private equity groups, going through negotiations, kind of pitting them against each other and getting a bidding war going. And at the last minute, a strategic buyer came in, Universal, who had known the former founder who had given his shares to James for $1. Knew James, was super impressed, just was one of the companies that kind of fell through the cracks that we hadn't reached out to. They were newer, and it was a holding company that had already acquired a couple smaller engineering groups based in Florida. And they came in at the last minute, provided a superior offer well above what the PE groups were willing to pay. And we got a deal done within a couple months. So it worked out really well for for the sellers. They got exactly what they wanted, and they got to continue to be part of a company that was growing and expanding and acquiring other firms. And they, on top of it, they kind of pegged James as going to be the CEO of multiple firms within their group, given his strong leadership styles. So it's a really interesting deal to work on. And on top of that, ended up closing in the middle of the pandemic. So we thought that was really going to throw a wrench in things. We officially closed in May of 2020. But thankfully, construction continued on, was deemed an essential business, and we were able to get the deal done. And I think that was all we had for you. Sorry for rushing through there at the end, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask away.
Perfect. Well, Olivia, Ryan, we really do appreciate you guys taking the time and speaking with us and answering, all of our questions. I just want to throw out to anybody on the call, again, the ACG is really, the ACG Cup has really been about students, and student education and student outcome, is really at the heart of everything that we do. I know I've known Olivia for 3 or 4 years now. If you guys have any questions, outside of this, connect with her on LinkedIn, connect with Ryan on LinkedIn. Don't be shy about, shooting them a message and asking them a question kind of offline. Both of them, I guess, would be more than happy to, take 20 minutes and speak with you guys, personally. So Olivia and Ryan, really do appreciate you guys. And hopefully the rest of you guys are tuning in for our 5:15 call with PNC.